Thanks everybody for watching this. I hope the information I'm about to give you is helpful. I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group, and I'm just going to walk you through in the next hour or so just the current standardized testing landscape, just to give you a general sense in terms of where we are in the midst of the pandemic, and also hopefully try to reassure you a little bit and hopefully provide some useful information for you. But three major goals for what I'm about to present. The first goal is to reassure you that these tests, at the end of the day, these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. Your sons and daughters' lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. But having said that, depending on the colleges that ultimately end up on your student's list, there might be colleges out there that will look at the scores, consider the scores, put some weight on the scores. So we don't want to completely put our heads in the sand either, but anything we can do to keep these tests in perspective and not give them more life than they deserve is always helpful. And then second goal tonight, as the title suggests, I'll just walk you through a little bit of a deeper dive on the standardized testing landscape. I'll talk about the PSAT in some detail. We'll go over the SAT and ACT as well. And then third goal tonight is I will just end the presentation talking about a testing plan, giving you some general guidelines and some things to think about at a high level as you're thinking about your student standardized testing plan. And with that, we'll dive in. So I start here, and I start with this slide because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. And what you're looking at here is this is a survey done by NACAC. So NACAC stands for the National Association of College Admission Counselors. And they reach out to college admission folk every year. And what they're trying to do in this survey is just to get a sense of these different factors you see here on the slide. How do they rank in terms of having considerable or moderate importance? And the NACAC folk, they do this survey every year. And the number one response to this survey every single year is always the same. The number one thing that colleges are looking at is the student's transcript, their grades, their day in and day out performance in school. The next thing they're going to look at is called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear this referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them at high school? And then depending on the colleges, you can see where the SAT and ACT fall in. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, 60,000 plus applications now, they are reading the essays from each application. They are reading the counselor recommendations. They are reading the teacher recommendations. They are looking at a student's extracurricular activities, any position of leadership that they've had, any work experience that they've had, and all of that is going to get factored into that final admission decision. And for those of you new to the college process, the term you'll hear around it is what's called a holistic review. And what the college admission folk are trying to do with that holistic review is get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's GPA, their standardized testing scores, put it in some kind of algorithm or formula, get a number back, and make that decision based on that number. All of these factors are going to get weighed into that final admission decision. And just unfortunately, as kind of the pandemic continues to rage on a little bit into the spring, I do just want to take a minute to talk about test optional schools. So what test optional schools are and what it means is that your students are in complete control of their standardized testing scores. So if they're applying to a test optional school, they decide whether they're going to send those scores as part of their application or not. So if they decide that their scores are reflective, are going to be supportive of their application and reflective of what they're doing day in and day out in school, they'll go ahead and send those scores. The college admission folk from test optional schools, they'll see the scores, they'll consider those scores. It will be part of that application read that college admission officer is doing. However, if for whatever reason that score comes in a little bit lower than what students were expecting or what they were hoping, and they're applying to a test optional school, they are not obligated to send that score. The college admission person will not see that score, and they'll make their admission decision based on those other factors that we see in that previous slide. And when you talk to college admission folk from test optional schools, they're not playing gotcha here. They're not saying, okay, students coming, for instance, from Andover High School, chances are pretty good that they probably had an opportunity to take an official test. They're choosing not to submit that score. Therefore, that score must be horrible. Therefore, we're not going to admit that student. When you talk to admission folk from test optional schools, what you'll hear is more along these lines, which is just, Drew, I just know for a certain percentage of students, I just know that that standardized testing score is not reflective of who that student is and what they're capable of academically. And I don't actually need to see that score in order to determine whether or not I feel they're going to be a good fit on our campus or not. I can get all that information from all those other factors that we saw on that previous slide. I don't need standardized testing scores to guide me. Of course, test optional does not mean test blind. So again, if students submit their scores, they will be considered. But again, if they don't, it's not going to be a red flag. It's not going to hurt that student. And what you're looking at here, just to orient us a little bit in terms of where we are with the test optional movement, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. This is just some examples of test optional schools. And I include these schools just to give you a sense that it's an increasingly selective list of schools that have gone test optional. It's not just kind of more rural schools or schools that don't typically appear on our students' lists. And I'll just point out a couple here. University of Chicago, they went test optional, I think, like 3 admission cycles ago. Colby College, Bucknell, 2 other colleges and universities that more recently went test optional. And then in the time of COVID, so there's another group of schools, again, not exhaustive, but I just list 2 here to give you a sense of it. These are schools who pre-pandemic may have been on the fence in terms of whether or not to go test optional, but then once the pandemic hit, they decided, you know what? We're going to try out a test optional policy. We're going to pilot it for the next couple years, try to collect some data, just kind of see how test optional works for us. And the schools on that list includes, again, this is not exhaustive, but for instance, Davidson College, Tufts University, for instance. And then there's a third group of colleges. And that third group of colleges, that's about 80 to 90% of the selective colleges that you don't see here on this list. So those are colleges like all the Ivy Leagues, Boston College, Vanderbilt, Tulane, MIT, for instance. They all went test optional, but just for our current seniors. And they went test optional just for our current seniors in direct response to what our seniors face this year in terms of trying to take and get a standardized test completed in the time of the pandemic, when the pandemic was raging last spring, and then also continued into the fall. So in terms of the test optional movement, there is a little bit of uncertainty around it in terms of what those schools that just went test optional for a year are going to do going forward. We are starting to hear from a couple of them. So Harvard, for instance, UPenn, Cornell, Williams, they were all schools that announced that they were just going test optional for 1 year for our current seniors, but they recently came out and said that they're extending their test optional policies for another year. So for our current juniors, we are anticipating that many more schools are going to follow suit, and we're anticipating that for most colleges that are going to appear on our current juniors list, that most of them are in fact going to end up being test optional. So with that kind of test optional context in mind, as students approach the standardized testing landscape in the spring for our juniors, we just want them to have kind of a everything to win, nothing to lose mentality as they take these tests. Obviously, we want them to try the tests, chance for them to show off a little bit, chance for them to show colleges and universities another data point that they're academically ready to do the college level work that will be required of them. But just knowing that if for whatever reason that score comes in a little bit lower than what you were hoping or what you were expecting, you're not going to be obligated to send that score. Colleges won't see that score. You're not going to be evaluated on that score. But if it does go well, you do get a score that you feel is reflective and supportive of your application. You're going to go ahead and submit it. It will be considered and read as part of that application. So that's where that kind of everything to win, nothing to lose mentality comes from. There are a couple caveats to the test optional movement that I just want to go over quickly. The first is just keep in mind that pre-COVID, especially for some of these more selective schools on this list, it may have been upwards 70, 80, 90% of applicants were going to go ahead and submit standardized testing scores. So example, University of Chicago there, upwards of 80% of students who applied ended up sending their scores. And that percentage actually doesn't surprise me. I've been helping students and families and guiding them through this process since 2010. And I can honestly say the vast majority of students, by the time they're done taking these standardized tests and by the time they're applying in that fall of senior year, most students are going to feel pretty good about their scores, feel like they're reflective, and go ahead and send those scores on to those schools. So we're not going to find out until the summer in terms of the pandemic's effect on students' ability to take tests and submit scores. We're anticipating that for some of these more selective schools, again, that percentage is going to be a little bit lower, but certainly they did receive applications from students that had scores. And then the second kind of caveat around the test optional school movement is just if you're a recruited athlete and you're applying to a test optional school, just be aware that that college coach might require a standardized testing score from you and might need a standardized testing score from you. We don't have time to do a deep dive on this tonight, but it's around this idea of an overall academic index score. Those colleges just want to make sure that their college coaches are recruiting athletes that meet a certain academic threshold, and standardized testing can be part of that formula that they use to make sure that students meet that mark. And then the third caveat around the test optional school movement is just around this idea of merit aid. So what merit aid is generally non-need-based financial aid. The colleges that give merit aid, they're using it as a recruitment tool to try to entice strong students to apply and ultimately enroll at their institution. So this is just one example, just to give you a feel for this. This is from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And you can see it's a strong student, 3.5 out of a 4.0 scale. And also you can see as the standardized testing scores go up, you can see the amount of that merit aid award also going up. And I don't want the take-home message from this slide to be, I don't want you to stare at this and be like, oh my gosh, Drew, so we got to make sure that we get our standardized testing scores as high as possible so that we can maximize this aid. It's more just putting it on your radar that back in my day, we always thought of standardized testing scores as something students needed or we all needed to get into college, but it's no longer just about getting in. These testing scores can also be useful in terms of maximizing that merit aid. And especially if you're willing to expand the list a little bit, the college list a little bit, look at schools in the South, look at schools in the Midwest, look at schools on the West Coast. You might be surprised in terms of what that college might offer you in terms of a merit aid grant. Again, with the idea being that it's going to entice you to ultimately enroll at their institution. The reason why I talk about merit aid here, coming after the test optional slide, is just be aware that there are schools out there who are admitting test optionally now, but when they consider these merit aid awards, they are still factoring in standardized testing scores. And if you're applying to a college that you know gives merit aid and is test optional, you can always just call them up and ask, do they consider standardized testing scores in these merit aid awards or not? And they'll give you an honest answer. They'll tell you what their policies are. And again, I'm going to review a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan, it's answering three pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And hopefully the testing plan does a couple things for your student. Hopefully it just reduces some of the anxiety around these standardized tests. Just knowing when students are taking them and having them on their radar can go a long way in terms of reducing some of the stress. And then the other thing you got to keep in mind is these tests are still taken by students across the country. So the vast majority of students still wake up on a Saturday morning, for instance, and they're like, oh my gosh, I have the SAT today. They go in and they take the test and they walk out of there and they're like, that was horrible, but at least I'm done with this. But if you have the testing plan mapped out ahead of time, Hopefully it ensures that your student's not going to go in cold. They're going to know what to expect on that test, putting them in that best position possible to show off a little bit, put their best foot forward. Again, try to get a score that's more reflective of what they're doing day in and day out in school. A couple other points on the testing plan. I know there's huge pressures out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 and start that earlier, earlier, and earlier. But just keep in mind that performance on these tests correlates with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So the later students take the test, the better they perform. So most students are going to peak on these tests later in spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. And at the end of the day, that quote perfect testing plan is really what works best for your student and what works best for you as a family. It's going to be customized for your student, so please do not worry if your testing plan ends up being different than what a best friend is doing or a neighbor is doing or possibly even what an older sibling did. There's many, many paths to success here. Again, at the end of the day, that best testing plan is what works best for your student. So when we're talking about the standardized testing landscape, these are the tests we're talking about. PSAT really just for practice. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make admission decisions based on PSAT scores. SAT, ACT is going to be the bulk of what I walk us through tonight. Subject tests, you can see they have a line through them. Subject tests, they're just hour-long curriculum-based tests. They used to go by different names. Back in my day, they were called achievement tests. They've also been called SAT2s. More recently, they've been referred to as subject tests. And the reason why it has a line through them is literally last week, the College Board announced that they were completely getting rid of subject tests going forward. So for juniors, if you were potentially thinking about taking a subject test this spring, you do not need to worry about it. You can completely eliminate subject tests from your standardized testing plan. They are not being offered. Colleges are not looking for subject tests. They're not looking for those scores. Similarly, if there's sophomores or younger students on the call who were thinking about taking a subject test this spring, same story. They're not going to get offered. You can't take them. Again, it's nice. It just kind of simplifies the standardized testing landscape a little bit. And then AP exams, a little bit outside the scope of what we're going to cover. I will talk about them briefly more towards the end. So I'm going to start with the PSAT. It is just a practice test. It's practice for that SAT. Anytime students get the opportunity to take an official test, especially when it doesn't count, it's always good practice. For them. And I know when students get their score back, they always kind of focus on this top line score, like what was my PSAT math score? What was my PSAT verbal score? But the real benefit of the PSAT, it's not so much in that score itself. It's more, the value is more in the itemized score report that students get back, where if they have the discipline to do it and do a deeper dive on that score report, they'll see every question they got right, every question they got wrong, and it will just give them an overall sense of how they did. They'll be able to identify their areas of strengths, those areas of weaknesses, those areas they need to improve upon before they take these tests later in that spring of junior year. You can kind of see the way the slide is set up. These scores or these tests are all what they call vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use your PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT because it is the score you would have gotten had you taken an SAT on that day. But just keep in mind, you took that PSAT in October of junior year, you're not going to peak on this until later of spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. So please don't worry or don't panic if that PSAT score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping for, a little bit lower than what you were expecting. And especially for sophomores who took the PSAT, again, it's a good exercise in terms of just getting some exposure to standardized testing, getting a feel for what's on that SAT. But again, you're not going to peak on this until another like possibly year and a half, 2 years out. So just again, don't panic if that PSAT score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping. But because it is vertically aligned, if for instance you got a 600 math 650 verbal on that PSAT. That is the score you would have gotten had you taken an SAT on that day. So you can use it as a baseline score for that SAT. And then just real quickly, I'll walk you through the score reports just so you have a better feel in terms of what you're looking at. So that total score, that's just the combination of that evidence-based reading and writing score. I think of that as being the verbal, and then your math score. So they add these two together. That's where that 960 comes from. You'll also see your percentile, just to give you a feel in terms of nationally, where does your score place you? Just be aware that juniors who took the test, you're only compared to other juniors. Sophomores who took the test, you're only compared to other sophomores. And then the value of the test scores here, because that 430 evidence-based reading and writing score is your average of your reading and your writing score, to figure out how you did on the reading section versus how you did on the writing and language section, you can take your test score, which is on an 8 to 38 point scale, and just multiply it by 20. That's going to put it back on that 160 to 760 scale, which is what the PSAT is scored on. So if we do that, you see that 23, you multiply that by 20, that gives the student a 460 on the reading. Same thing with the writing and language, 400 on the writing and language. Average those together, you get a 430. But it gives you a sense in terms of, did the student do a little bit better on the reading? Did they do better on the writing? Was it the same? And from this analysis, you can see student did a little bit better on the reading, a little bit weaker on the writing and language or that grammar portion of the test. If you go online into your College Board account and you look at your PSAT scores online, you get some additional information. Again, the ultimate goal of this being to identify your overall strengths and weaknesses. And I'll just take a minute just to teach you kind of how to speak College Board on this. But your sub scores, they're on a 1 through 15 scale in these different topics. So command of evidence, these usually show up in the reading questions where students are going to be asked to point to line numbers from a passage in order to defend their answer. We'll look at an example of this a little bit later. Words in context, this is the way the SAT tests vocabulary now. It's not like those esoteric SAT words that they used to have on it. It's more common words now, but it's words that have more than one meaning. And then depending on how that word is used within a reading passage, students are going to be asked to pick the correct definition of that word. Expression of ideas, this is out of the grammar portion or the writing and language portion. Just how well students are asked questions about how well a passage is organized, how clearly it was written. Standard English conventions, these are some more formal grammar rules that students are asked. So for instance, students are asked, about verb tense, they're asked about punctuation usage. Heart of algebra, these are questions that more typically appear in an Algebra 1 class. Problem solving and data analysis, just some basic statistics. It's not to the level that students will see in, for instance, like an AP stats class or anything like that. And then passport to advanced math, these are math topics that are more typically covered, for instance, in an Algebra 2 type of class. But just at a high level, you can get a sense that just from this analysis that students need to work on a little bit more, maybe some of that data analysis, also maybe a little bit weaker on that Algebra 2 section. And then also online, if you go do a deeper dive on the online score report, you can also get information in terms of the skills insight. This is all algorithm based. This is purely based on terms of your score and the different questions you answered correctly and the ones that you missed. But if you go into this, you can see how the College Board kind of lists based on your score, you are likely able to your strengths here, and then some weaknesses, those areas you need to improve on. And they'll do it for all the different sections, the reading section, the grammar section, and the math section. So just obviously take it with a grain of salt. It is an algorithm that's determining this. Obviously, it's not someone from the College Board doing a deep dive on your scores and then typing all of this in, but it can provide some insights and some additional areas needed for for practice. And then just real quickly on the NMSQT part of this. So the NMSQT, it stands for the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. Only juniors are eligible for this. So even if sophomores scored really, really highly on this test, because you're a sophomore, you're not eligible for the national merit. Couple points on the national merit, just quickly. It is an incredibly selective and competitive competition. It is less than 1% of students who are going to qualify or be named a national merit semifinalist and finalist. So please do not worry if you just missed the cutoff for this. It's not going to negatively impact your college admission process in any way, shape, or form. Because again, colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make admission decisions based on your PSAT scores. But the way the National Merit Scholarship works is all juniors who took the PSAT are then eligible for this competition. And what they're going to do is they're going to calculate based on how you did your selection, your NMSC selection index score. And where that comes from, they're just going to take the student's reading test score. So they got a 23. They're going to double it for a final score of 46. They're going to do the same thing for the writing and language test score. So for our sample student here, that student got a 20. They double that to a 40. The math test score was a 26.5, double it 53. And then they add them all up to get their total. This student's total was a 139. So the highest score that students can get in this competition is a 228. And just to get a feel for the competitiveness of this, different states have different qualifying scores just because they don't want all of our students from Massachusetts to win these awards and to try to be equitable and to get a more even geographic distribution of these awards. In Massachusetts, every single year, we have usually one of the highest qualifying scores in this competition. But to give you a feel for it, so a student who scored a 223 out of 228, that was the cutoff score. So if a student got a 222 in the state of Massachusetts, they were not eligible for this award. And colleges know this. They know that especially in Massachusetts, the cutoff is really high. They know really strong and bright students are going to get shut out from this. So if your student just missed this award, please do not worry. Again, it's not going to negatively impact your college admission process. And also keep in mind, the monetary award for this scholarship has not been adjusted for inflation since its inception. Not to depress us, but it used to cover like a full year of tuition and room and board. Now it covers like books. So the award is about $2,500 a year. Obviously, if you get it, you're going to cash the check because every little bit helps. But if you just missed it, it's not like you missed out on some like $270,000 scholarship or anything like that. And again, the real value of the PSAT, it's not so much in the top line score, it's more in this itemized score report where students will see every question they got right, every question they got wrong, the difficulty level of that question. And if they have the discipline to go back through this in a little bit more detail, it will just point out some areas of strength, some areas of weaknesses. So for instance, on the math, you'll get a breakdown. How did you do on the no calculator section versus the calculator section? Also, just did you make careless errors? Did you miss some easier questions, or were they all concentrated on some of the harder ones? Those are the type of insights that you can get from doing a deeper dive on this score report. And I include this slide just because this is probably the #1 question that I get at this presentation before we start doing a deeper dive on the SAT and ACT. And the question goes something like this, which is just true. We're applying from the Northeast. We're applying in a fairly selective college admission cycle. Can my son or daughter really get into his or her top school choice by just submitting an ACT score? And for those of you new to this, the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either the SAT or ACT. You have to think about this as Coke versus Pepsi a little bit. There are two separate tests, two separate organizations. As you can see from the slide, they are in a market share battle with one another. But to answer that hypothetical question, colleges accept both tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. So your student absolutely can get into his or her top school choice by just submitting an ACT score. These tests are weighted equally. Colleges, again, they don't see a test as a superior test and one test as an inferior test. The reason why here in the Northeast, we still have kind of an SAT first bias. That's more historical than anything. So historically, SAT, more of a test taken by students on the East Coast and West Coast, whereas an ACT, more of a test taken by students in the Midwest. But that landscape's totally changing. More and more of our students in the Northeast are taking and applying to college with an ACT score. And actually more and more students in the Midwest are taking and applying to college with an SAT score. So just to orient us before we do a deeper dive on these tests, this is kind of the 30,000-foot view of standardized testing. But anytime a standardized test creator writes a standardized test, two components go into the design of that test. The first is what I'm going to call aptitude versus curriculum. So aptitude in its purest form, we think of that as being more of an IQ type of test, measuring a student's, quote, innate ability to learn, whereas curriculum-based test, exactly as it sounds, more in line with what students are doing day in and day out in school. The other component is what I'm going to call speed versus power. Power speaks to the difficulty of the reading of the test, the trickiness of the questions on that test, whereas speed, exactly as it sounds, the difficulty comes from the pace of it. Can students actually work their way through that test in the time allotted? So not to bring back vicious flashbacks of your own standardized testing experience, but for those of us who took what I'm going to call that old SAT, you might remember tons of misdirection on that test, a lot of trying to make things seem much harder than they actually were. But the SAT now, very different test than the SAT we took back in the day. Much more of a curriculum-based test, much more in line with what students are doing day in and day out in school. But it's still the College Board, it's still the SAT, it still has what I call SAT-ness to it. There is still this element of power, there is still this element of trickiness and misdirection on it, but not to the extent of that old SAT. ACT was developed to be in direct competition with the SAT, and because historically SAT, always more of an aptitude test, always more of a power test, to compete against that, ACT has always been more of a curriculum-based test. Questions just a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more in line with what students are doing day in and day out in school, which is why, especially here in the Northeast, the ACT, it still has that reputation of being a, quote, easier test, but it's not easier per se. The difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. So often students who take an ACT for the first time, or ideally a practice ACT for the first time, usually they'll walk out of there and be like, Drew, I didn't think it was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. Most students feel rushed on it. Most students feel like they don't have the time they truly need to hit their full potential on that test. So here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests, just so you can get a feel for them at a high level. As you can see, there is a lot of overlap in terms of content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of their philosophy, in terms of how they kind of create it and the questions that they ask. And most students who see this slide, I usually give them about 35 seconds to a minute of staring at this. And usually after about that minute, most students will come back with like, Drew, like, come on, this is going to be the easiest decision I have to make in this whole college admission process. Just by looking at this slide, I know exactly which test I'm going to take, and I'm going to take the ACT. When they come to that conclusion, because they look at this 65-minute reading section on that SAT, that very first section, which is just a bear for students, and they compare that to a 35-minute reading section on that ACT, and they ask themselves or say to themselves, 65 minutes of reading versus 35 minutes of reading, this is a no-brainer. I'm going to do the ACT with that 35-minute reading section. But just to give you a feel for that pace of that ACT and that ACT reading section, it's 35 minutes, it's 4 passages, it's 40 questions, which breaks down to about 8.5 minutes per passage and 10 questions per passage, which, again, to give you a sense of just the pace of this thing, that breaks down further to 4 to 4.5 minutes for students to to read a pretty lengthy passage, and they can't just skim it. They actually have to read it for understanding. And that gives them 4 to 4.5 minutes to answer 10 questions. And they got to keep that pace up for that full 35 minutes. Writing and language and English, these are the two sections that are most similar to one another. This is the grammar portion of the test. Students are given passages with various grammatical errors and asked to correct them as they go. No calc on that SAT math, that stands for no calculator. Not trying to torment students by taking their calculator away, more measuring their math fluency. Do they know the math behind the math? Can they do math without a calculator? And then on the SAT, students will get their calculator back for that second math section. ACT, a little bit more student friendly. Students are allowed a calculator throughout, but again, the difficulty is the pace of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions, about 1 minute per question. Separate science section on the ACT, not science per se. It's not what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. More deductive reasoning and logic. Can students work their way through a scientific passage of which they might not know anything about that particular topic, using the tables, the figures, and the graphs and working their way through the questions? The idea of it is they'll have a better understanding of what that passage was about when they completed it than when they started it. No separate science section on the SAT, a little bit forced the way SAT tests science. According to the College Board, students are demonstrating their understanding of science if they can interpret a table. I might argue there might be a little bit more involved to doing science than just interpreting data from a table. But even though we're in, for instance, in the grammar portion of the test, there's going to be these data graphic questions sprinkled throughout. Real quickly on this optional essay, you can see there's a line through it on the SAT. Last week, as part of the announcement where the College Board announced that they were getting rid of subject tests, they also said they were getting rid of this optional essay. Colleges really weren't looking at it. They weren't putting any weight on the score. So College Board kind of saw the writing on the wall there and just recently canceled it. So starting in June, students will not have the option to take that essay. Our general recommendation for juniors, if you're taking it in March and May, and you can switch it to taking the test without the essay, go ahead and switch it. If you end up, for whatever reason, having to write that essay, don't worry. Again, colleges, they're not considering it. They're not putting weight on that score. Also an optional essay on that ACT test. ACT, they haven't gotten rid of it yet. We're not entirely sure exactly what they're going to do, if they're going to move in that direction also. So our general advice around that ACT essay is vast majority of students don't need to worry about it. They're not going to take this test with the essay. If you consider yourself a strong writer and want to show off a little bit, by all means, go ahead. You can take the test with that essay. But again, just keep in mind that schools really aren't paying attention to that score. They're not putting a lot of weight in it. But again, if you can write a good essay and get a decent score, it could be a very, very slight, plus, knowing that if for whatever reason the score comes in a little bit lower, again, colleges aren't putting a lot of weight or really looking at those scores. Real quickly, in terms of the scoring of it, of these tests, 200 to 800 on that evidence-based reading and writing score. I'm just going to call it verbal. 200, 800 on verbal, 200 to 800 on math. So we're back to that 400 to 1600 point scale. If you're not familiar with the ACT scoring, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges care about is the composite score, and that composite score is just the average. So just the average of that English, math, reading, and science scores. And then what we'll do now is I'll do a quick side-by-side comparison of some sample questions from these tests, just so you get a better feel in terms of how that power on the SAT compares to that speed on the ACT. And I'm gonna date myself a little bit with this joke, but back in my day, we had like a fountain pen and we learned to write in cursive and we wrote things like "Dear Sir." In today's day and age, it's all communicating via texting and emojis. So both tests just want to make sure that our students have been exposed to some grammar rules. So this is what it looks like on the ACT. SAT looks identical to this. Again, students are given passages with grammatical errors in them and asked to correct them as they go. Number 8 here is verb tense. Number 9 is punctuation. Do students know the correct usage of a colon or a semicolon? The differences between the SAT reading and ACT reading, in some ways we've already talked about this. It really comes down to the timing of these two sections. So SAT, 65 minutes, 5 passages, 13 minutes a passage, whereas ACT, 35 minutes, 4 passages, 8.5 minutes per passage. And in the world of standardized testing, just a huge difference between having 13 minutes on a passage and 8.5 minutes on a passage. So just by knowing that, you can probably guess that SAT reading is going to be a little bit harder. It's going to require a deeper reading, a closer reading, a more analytical reading, more questions along these lines. What can reasonably be inferred? And then for some of these questions, there's going to be a follow-up question. Which choice provides the best evidence? There's actually going to be line numbers in these answer choices, forcing students to do a deeper reading, a closer reading, almost a line-by-line reading of that passage. Whereas on the ACT, they really don't have time for this. More questions along the lines of the passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can students show they read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that author was trying to make? Which then brings us to everybody's favorite topic, the math. I chose 2 questions here. These are both slope of the line, but very, very different in terms of how the SAT approaches it versus how the ACT approaches it. And I'll just read the SAT one just so you can hear it. But the SAT one goes like this. The graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? And most students have the same reaction that we all have, especially when I read it like that, which is like, Drew, like what? Like, I have no idea. Like, what on earth is this question even asking me? SAT could have asked this in a more straightforward way. They could have asked this as the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But this is where the power comes in and the misdirection comes in. For students to figure that out, they have to figure out this whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b and figure out how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas on the ACT, just way less interested in playing that misdirection game, much more straightforward of a question. Students are given 2 lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3, and then they're asked for the slope of that perpendicular line. And you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes or you don't. If you do remember it, you know it's C, -1/3. If you don't remember it, you're choosing your favorite ACT letter and then moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head here. There's no trying to figure out what that question is asking. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between that speed of the ACT compared to that power of that SAT. Other notable differences on the math. SAT has a much narrower and deeper focus on the math. 60 to 70% of the math is algebra, so algebra 1 and algebra 2. Obviously, if they emphasize something, they need to de-emphasize something. What they de-emphasized was geometry. So geometry is less than 10% of the math that's on that SAT. Again, that no calculator section, not trying to torment students, more measuring their math fluency. Can they actually do math without a calculator? ACT, much broader and shallower in its focus. Only 30% is algebra, so way more geometry on that ACT compared to that SAT. Calculator allowed throughout, but again, the difficulty is the pace of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions, about 1 minute per question. Which then brings us to that ACT science section. And the ACT science section, it looks something like this. And by design, it's kind of designed to take students' breaths away. Usually students who encounter an ACT science section for the first time, usually their reaction is like, Drew, there's no way. There's no way in 35 minutes I'm going to be able to answer 40 questions that all have figures and graphs that look like this. It's not actually as bad as it seems. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to be able to answer the question. So really what I need to be able to do is just look where it's telling me to look. So according to figure 1, so my first job is to find figure 1, which has to be this because it's the only thing on the slide. The temperature of the outer core, well, I can find the outer core. I know the outer core is there, and I know how to read a graph, so I know I'm on the y-axis here. So I know I'm between these 2 dashed lines. I know I'm between these 2 points. So the temperature of the outer core is approximately between. I know that answer is C, 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I've found. I have no idea what that answer choice actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students struggle with the ACT. Because it's such a fast-paced test and students are working at a pace that's generally faster than what they're comfortable with or used to, the ACT has the tendency to turn on everybody's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this, which is just, Drew, you did that question awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this or triple check this or quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them a strategy and an approach, it's also building their confidence up that they can see a question like this, circle answer choice C, and without any hesitation or doubt, move on to that next question. Again, a little bit forced the way the SAT incorporates science into their tests. This is that SAT data graphic question, where students are given tables and graphs, and even though we're in the writing and language or the grammar portion, they're going to be asked to interpret this table, thereby demonstrating their understanding of science. Again, it's a little bit forced. The trickiness or the power of this question comes from not only are students going to be asked to interpret the data, but also how does the data in this table actually support the central argument that that author is trying to make in that passage. So again, a lot of overlap between these two tests in terms of the content, but very, very different in terms of their approaches. With that SAT being more of a power test, more challenging questions, harder reading, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the math with the emphasis on algebra, but more time per question. Whereas ACT questions generally more straightforward, but does require that instant recognition, as we saw with that slope of the line math problem and that ACT science question. Broader scope of skills, again, more math topics, more geometry on that ACT, but the difficulty is the pace of it. Almost a total sprint from start to finish on that test. Which then brings me to the $1 million question. And the $1 million question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew, so we know colleges accept both tests equally, either the SAT or the ACT. Why spend all this time and effort in terms of trying to prepare and take both if we can narrow that down and pick one? Either go down an SAT path or go down an ACT path, but which one should we choose? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student is going to prefer the SAT, this type of student is going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is ideally to try both in a practice setting so you don't have the pressure of sitting for an official test. And then there is a concordance table where you can compare your scores from a practice SAT to a practice ACT. And keep in mind that PSAT, it is the baseline score for an SAT, so you can use that PSAT score as an SAT score in trying to decide whether you're going down an SAT or an ACT path. And just if you're not familiar with us, again, I'm with Summit Educational Group. We do offer free proctored practice tests with remote capacity now in our Newton office, but we're also proctoring them remotely over Zoom. So just if your student has taken a PSAT for the juniors and just interested in trying an ACT, I just encourage you to reach out to us to set that up, and then you're off and running. Are you going down an SAT path or an ACT path? So this is what the concordance table looks like. I know it's a little bit small where you can compare an SAT or a PSAT score to an ACT score. I'll just blow this up just to orient us a little bit. But 24 out of 36 on that ACT, the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT. And then 30 out of 36 on that ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Keep in mind, 70 to 80% of students are going to score equally well on both tests. So often the decision as to whether or not to go down an SAT path or an ACT path, it really kind of comes down to a student's gut instinct. We kind of joke with them like, which one did you hate the least? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which one do you think you're going to have an easier time getting that score to be more reflective of what you're doing day in and day out in school? And then just real quickly on the AP exams, you can see the schedule in terms of when the College Board is hoping to be able to offer them. We have heard from the College Board that they're going to do everything that they can to try to ensure that students can do a full length AP exam. So the full 3 to 3.5 hour test. Last May, you may have been familiar with this, but they offered, because everything was shut down, They did offer a modified AP exam that students could take at home. It was just an open response question. There was no multiple choice. It was only 45 minutes, but the College Board is really trying to bring back the full 3 to 3.5 hour test. So just be aware, if your students are in AP classes and are taking these AP exams, that they're going to need to prepare for. They're going to need to prep for and prepare for that full exam. Chances are it's not going to be that modified one that they did last year. Obviously, the College Board, they can obviously shift and change it if they need to, depending on how the pandemic later in the spring ends up looking. But that is their plan right now. And then in terms of creating the testing plan, when should I take them? So here's when the tests are offered. You can see they're offered pretty much every single month with the exception of January. Both the SAT and ACT have added dates in the summer. So hooray, there's summer testing now. But please, 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 I cannot stress this enough. Please do not have this be your standardized testing plan. No one wants students to take these tests 8, 9, 10 times. It's just too much. The scores don't just keep going up and up and up every time students take the tests. They do plateau. At a certain point, you'll start seeing scores drop. And that's when really kind of the anxiety and the frustration really starts to build around these tests. So most students aren't one and done on these tests just because the first time they take it, they're always a little bit nervous. But most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it 2, maybe a third time in that fall of senior year. And then just other kind of general guidelines. Again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something much more sane and sensible. We're also trying to avoid going like ACT, SAT to ACT to SAT, and then kind of rinse, lather, repeat on that in that fall of senior year. Again, encouraging students to try some practice tests earlier in the process, a little bit of upfront work, but hopefully it will save them time and lead to a more efficient plan, because then they can pick a test. Am I focusing on the ACT or am I focusing on the SAT? And generally our recommendation is to target SAT or ACT, depending on which path you're on, twice, kind of in later of spring of junior year, and then a third possible time in that fall of senior year. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something much more sane and sensible, which again, just to give you a feel for it, might look something like this. So this was Caden. Caden did his PSAT in October, used that as his baseline score for the SAT, took a practice test with us kind of December, January, early February is usually the timeline for some of our juniors to get going on it. Scored equally well on both tests, but had a slight preference for the ACT. So we targeted April and June for his first 2 attempts at the ACT. He was in AP classes, so he is taking the AP exam in May, and then just potential possible third time on that ACT in September, just if that score ends up being not reflective of what he's doing day in and day out in school, just in case he wants to try it one more time in that fall of senior year. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something much more sane and sensible. And again, this is just one example. There's many different paths here. There's always reasons as to why we might start a little bit earlier and push that timeline up for that first test. So for instance, recruited athletes, because coaches want scores earlier and earlier, might be a group of students that might test a little bit earlier than that, maybe December of junior year. Also strong students who are just comfortable with standardized testing, again, they might start a little bit earlier, targeting fall for that first or late fall of junior year for that first test. And again, if there's juniors on the call who went down that path and took the test in December, again, please don't worry if that score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping or what you were expecting, because you're not going to peak on this until later of spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. And then just in the last couple minutes here, I do just want to go over score choice and super scoring, just so you're familiar with these policies. Almost all colleges honor what they call score choice. I think we're over like 95% of colleges now. So what that means is you are in complete control of your scores. So even if a school is requiring standardized testing, but if, for instance, you've taken the test more than once and the first time you took it, you were a little bit nervous and maybe it didn't go so well, you are not obligated to send that score to that school. You decide which scores the schools actually see. Just be aware This is not an exhaustive list, but it is a very small list though. There are some schools out there that do want to see all scores. So every time you take a standardized test, an official one, they want to see that score. So for instance, Georgetown, Yale, Barnard, Elon is even on that list. Not entirely clear why colleges want to see all scores. I think they're trying to get a sense of a student's testing history. Just, for that student who is like, Drew, I totally hear you, like taking this test 10, 11, 12 times, like completely insane, but I don't care. If that's what it takes, that's what I'm going to do. Hopefully just knowing that there might be some schools that end up on that student's list that might see that. Hopefully it might get that student to rethink that plan a little bit, maybe do something a little bit more sane and sensible. And then the other reason why there's schools that do want to see all scores, which is why I include Elon on this list, it's because they're in fact super scoring. So what super scoring means is if students have taken the test more than once, they'll send the full score reports from the different times that students have taken the test. And then what that college that super scores is going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores from those different administrations and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though the student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting, for those colleges that super score the SAT, that's going to be that student's SAT score. And we're over like 90% of colleges super scoring the SAT. Most do. And just keep in mind, the colleges that super score, they're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to trick you into sending more testing scores so that they can see, for instance, the 580, they can see the 640, they can ask themselves, which one's the real one? Is it the 580? Is it the 640? Should we average it? For the schools that super score, they're going to cherry pick and pull down that highest subsection score every time. Because keep in mind, it's in the college's best interest to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. We all kind of load the US News and World Report rankings, but standardized testing is still part of those rankings. Even things you wouldn't even think of, like a college's bond rating, can be impacted by their published SAT and ACT scores. And also, again, I've been helping students and guiding families through the standardized tests since 2010. And I can honestly say this 1290 is more reflective of what that student's capable of academically. That student did not get that score by chance. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't luck. So by looking at the super score, they're actually looking at a more reflective SAT or ACT score. So this is the way it works on the SAT. ACT, it works identical for those colleges that super score it. Slightly lower percentage of colleges super scoring the ACT. I think we're at about 70% of colleges, but that percentage goes up every single admission cycle, and we're anticipating that trend is going to continue. But it works the exact same way. Student took the ACT 3 times, send the full score reports from each time they took the test. And then for the colleges that super score the ACT, they're going to recalculate that composite. So even though this student did not get a 31 in a single sitting on that ACT, for those colleges that super score the ACT, that's going to be that 31 is that student's ACT score. Again, even though they didn't get it in that single sitting. And then just the third part about that testing plan, how and when should students prepare for them? Just as we want to do something sane and sensible on the testing side, we also want to do something sane and sensible on any test prep that students do. So we don't want to be prepping for this a year and a half, 2 years. It's just too much. We want to do something a little bit more sensible. So for most students, depending on their starting score and depending on their goal score, most students are going to be looking at about 2 to 3 months of study heading into that official test date. Just to give you a feel for it, for us, when we're working with students, that translates to about an hour and a half session once per week, one-on-one, and then students will have 2 to 3 hours of homework between sessions. So students are looking at usually between like 3.5, 4.5 hour commitment in terms of really giving themselves a chance of improving that score and getting it to be more reflective of what they're doing day in and day out in school. And then in terms of what goes into the test prep, 3 major areas. So one is content, just knowing what's on the test, knowing all the math, for instance, knowing all the grammar. The other is strategy, just having a game plan, for every question and every section that they're going to see. And then that best form of practice is practice, practice, practice on officially retired tests. So for students who are self-motivated and want to try some self-study, just know there's 10 official practice tests that the College Board have released. So full tests, full scales, full answer explanations. ACT, they put out the Red Book. It's the official guide to the ACT. There's 5 full length practice tests and answer explanations and so forth in that book, but you can also find another 3 or 4 online. So just make sure any prep that students do, you want to make sure that it incorporates all 3 of these elements. It's not just practice test after practice test after practice test after practice test. There does have to be some content and strategy incorporated into that review as well. And I know we've covered a lot in about an hour. So just want to sum up just some general guiding principles as you're thinking about a testing plan for your students. But again, most students are going to score the same, regardless of whether they go SAT or ACT. A little bit of upfront work in terms of a little bit of an upfront investment, but it will save you time down the road and leads to a much more efficient plan if you can try both, again, ideally in a practice setting, and then pick a path. Are you going down an SAT path? Are you going down an ACT path? Just know, because there is so much overlap in content, any prep that students do for one test is going to help with that other test. So if, for instance, they started going down an SAT path and just they want to try an ACT, all the work they've done on that SAT is going to help with that ACT and vice versa. And I know I've said this a number of times, but I know that there's huge pressures out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 testing. But just keep in mind that performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. So most students are going to peak on these tests later in spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. So that's generally when we target having students take that test. Again, there's always exceptions to it as to why we might push the timeline up, but vast majority of students, that's when they're going to be taking these tests. And I just leave you with this note. We know at the end of the day, the number one thing that colleges are looking at is a student's grades, their day in and day out academics and performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say on this side of the computer, but really these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process, especially in a test optional world. We're still encouraging students to test. It's a chance for them to show off a little bit. It's a chance for them, again, to provide another data point that they're academically ready for the rigors of academic work at college or universities. But just know they are in a kind of everything to win, nothing to lose environment. So hopefully that also just helps take some of the pressure off of students. And also just if students are registering for tests later in the spring and they get canceled, just know we are anticipating many schools are going to be test optional and are going to be understanding. But if students do get the opportunity to test, obviously we want them to put their best foot forward, do the best they can, see it as a chance to kind of show off a little bit, support that application that they'll be submitting. And again, I'm Drew from Summit. If you're not familiar with us, we're based here out of our Newton office. Again, feel free to take advantage of our online proctored practice tests that we run every weekend over Zoom. For juniors, if you have that PSAT score, you can use that as a baseline score for your SAT. I encourage you, if you want to try an ACT, to give us a call just to get a feel for what that test is like. For sophomores who are listening to this recording, a little bit early to get going now, but our general recommendation for sophomores, late spring, early summer, give us a call. It's a great chance to take a practice, full-length practice SAT, full-length practice ACT. Doesn't mean we would start prep over the summer, but at least we can map it out. So you can know, okay, we're going down an SAT path, going down an ACT path, which is a nice position to be in going into that start of junior year. And again, if you're not familiar with us, we do specialize in one-on-one in-home once the pandemic lifts or once we all get vaccinated and can do that again. But we are providing all of our one-on-one tutoring online. We also do academic tutoring as well. So just If you're struggling with sort of the remote model of learning, or just feel like you need some additional academic support, please don't hesitate to reach out to us for that. And we do provide AP tutoring as well. So just if you need some, just a little bit of help going into that AP exam, or if you're struggling just with the pace or the content of your AP exam, please, again, don't reach out. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can see my email here. As you can tell, we love talking shop and supporting families through this process. So just as you're watching this, please don't hesitate to email us with any questions that you might have. All right, thanks everybody. I hope this was helpful. Again, the advantage of recording this is you can go back and re-listen to anything you may have missed, because I know we covered a lot of ground. And also, please feel free to share the link with friends or colleagues who might have interest in this topic. All right, thanks everybody. So appreciate your time, taking the time to listen to this, and I hope this was helpful.